impoverished young girl was forced to marry a man older than her father. What happened next? No one expected. In Redstone, the heat sat like a judgment. Clara Holt, 19, bare-ankled and burning with an ugly resolve, stood framed by the sagging porch as every eye counted her like a debt. Her father's whiskey breath still clung to the air. The preacher's script rustled like old paper. Elias Kane, 44, broad as a barn door with a hand scar that sliced through his sleeve, waited with a look that could be read two ways, guardian or grave. When her father pushed, the girl did not stumble. She reached instead into the folds of her dress and produced a folded scrap. No one knew she'd kept a torn photograph, edges singed with a man's handwriting on the back and a date older than any of them remembered. She slammed it on the table and drove a knife beside it until the steel whispered a warning. "You traded more than me," she said, voice flat as drought. Someone in the crowd whispered the name on the photograph, and ears pricked like hounds. Elias stared not at the picture but at her hand, the tremor that had nothing to do with fear. He spoke softly, in a tone that silenced betting and gossip. "There are debts you can't see in ledgers." The word hung like who had Clara found, and why would that paper change what everyone expected to happen next? The question unfurled in every murmured breath. What skeleton did the Kane Ranch cradle, and would that secret save her or bury them all? Clara stood rigid, as the officiant's measured words flowed around her like a river she could not touch. The knife she had driven into the rough plank still quivering faintly. A metallic heartbeat that reminded her how recently she had chosen defiance over silence. The ranch yard hummed with conversation that tried to pass for compassion. At the same time, curiosity camouflaged itself as concern, and every face seemed to hold a private ledger of judgment that balanced on the edges of gossip and obligation. Above, the sky pressed low and pale, a ceiling of dust and heat that made the preacher's script sound fragile and small against the weight of what had been arranged in the dim recklessness of her father's desperation. Her father's glare cut like a weathered rope tightened at the neck, a familiar cruelty softened only by the dull flush of drink and the hollow pride of a man who had traded future for bottles and borrowed coin. Elias Kane's presence, in contrast, was a quiet geometry, broad shouldered, a straight back, hands that rested easily at his sides as if the world had taught him to hold things without needing to claim them. His words earlier had been spare and level, and now that same evenness echoed through the ceremony like an unusual mercy. Though his voice had promised no coercion, distrust braided itself into Clara's thoughts, an old muscle of suspicion that had learned to flex whenever bargains were struck where women were counted as collateral. The procession of vows felt like a performance staged to satisfy witnesses who measured a person's worth by contracts and cattle, and when rings were slid onto trembling fingers, they felt like iron seals stamped on an uncertain future. By dusk the ranch house swallowed sun and shadow alike, and Clara found herself a wife by law yet unclaimed by the tender customs of companionship. The name conferred upon her sat like an alien garment, stitched at the seams and heavy with another man's history. She retreated to the sparse room assigned to her with the polite brutality of someone cataloging disposables, a space without personal possession or memory. One narrow bed, a window that looked out on scrub and horizon, a wooden washstand dulled by use, and a trunk whose lid had been pried open to accept what belonged to her past life. The trunk lay on the floor like a quiet protest, its canvas and straps bearing the smell of old cedar and a faint trace of her mother's lavender that had been pressed into folded collars before the world tightened around them. She set the knife aside with a careful motion that kept the memory of its ring alive without letting rage become action. Steadiness mattered now, for any reckless movement could be read as mutiny and punished in ways the town had learned to enforce with looks and ledger entries. In the thin light she unpacked a shawl and a small stack of letters, each edged with smudged ink that carried a father's handwriting whose tenderness, if it had ever existed, had been eaten by the same debts that had sold her name. Her fingers traced a seam on a dress and felt the frayed thread of upbringing. Memory arrived in small untidy fragments, laughter in a kitchen that smelled of coffee and flour, Lila's small hand fitting into hers like a promise, her mother humming a melody that had no place in this new life. The room's single chair cradled a hat that still wore the scent of tobacco. A reminder that Elias's world included certain habits and histories she had never been asked to inhabit. She wondered if his quiet contained storms as potent as the ones that had battered her family. A wind blew outside, a long desolate thing that set the rafters whispering and made the loose shutters slap with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. It was as if the landscape itself reflected the argument she had waged silently with fate. She closed the trunk and pressed both palms against the wood until warmth traveled from her skin into the lid. The act felt ceremonial, as though she were sealing one life inside and signaling the beginning of another. Though the boundary between those lives remained ambiguous and dangerous, locks were turned and bolts slid home with a small satisfying click that sang to her of a private space at last. A place where decisions could be thought through without the town's eyes cataloging every breath. She stood at the window and watched dusk collect into a long, blue bruise along the horizon. Moonlight climbed the ridge and settled in the hollow of the valley, painting the fields with a mild silver that seemed to ask whether change was punishment or possibility, and the question lingered like smoke. Elias's footsteps moved along the hall outside with the measured sound of a man who had learned how to inhabit a house without making claims on the furniture of someone else's life. The steps were soft and soon faded, leaving only the cedar dust and the nervous echo of her own breath. Left alone, Clara listened to the building creak the way old houses tell stories, each settling board a sentence in a history she had not chosen but would now have to read and answer to. In the dark she unrolled the shawl and wrapped it around her shoulders like armor, feeling the fabric cling and fold against a body that had not yet agreed to be owned by law or expectation. She let herself breathe through the shawl until her chest slowed and the tide of panic receded enough to allow thought. Her resolve was not a sudden blaze but a slow, methodical kindling born from small indignities and older resentments, and tonight those embers were fanned into coherence by the knowledge that Lila waited somewhere behind her father's debts, possibly marked for the same trade if she did not act. She remembered a lesson from childhood: stubbornness, when properly used, could be a compass. She closed her eyes and imagined paths. One that led back to Redstone under cover of night, one that led away into empty plains where anonymity might be bought with money she did not have, and one that stayed and carved dignity out of small daily choices. The room smelled faintly of soap and saddle grease, a strange mix that belonged to neither memory nor promise, and in that scent she found a small bitter clarity. Survival here meant learning where to bend and where to break. Clara thought of Elias's words earlier, the strange mercy in his voice when he had declared he would not take a wife by force. She allowed herself to examine the possibility that his refusal to seize her heart might be a door rather than a wall, though she would not mistake courtesy for affection. She plotted no immediate rebellion. Impulsive acts in the narrow world of frontier law often invited reprisal, and reprisals in Redstone tended to be measured with ledgers and long uncomfortable silences that could ruin more than a night. She considered the slow work of observation, learning the rhythms of the house, the habits that made Elias wake with the dawn, the way he spoke to the ranch hands, the times he left the valley, and the small kindnesses that might be coaxed into something steadier over months if patience proved a better instrument than fury. Outside, the wind continued its lament, and for a moment she allowed herself to grieve the life she had expected and the childish illusions of fairness she had once entertained. Grief steadied her resolve rather than distracted it, carving in her a sense of purpose that felt almost pragmatic. When she finally lay down, the mattress creaked under her weight and held her like a judgment that had not yet been pronounced. The room seemed larger with her attention focused inward, and the vastness of the frontier sky beyond the glass felt less like a prison than a map with many forks. Sleep came in shallow waves, punctuated by dreams where she and Lila ran, until the dust became a cloak and old ledgers flew apart in the wind, their entries dissolving like ash. She woke with a throat raw from a dream cry and a plan assembling itself, not in dramatic gestures but in a sequence of small resolute acts that might, over time, topple a ledger's power. Her plan was tentative, sketched in fragments: a trusted neighbor's favor, a night ride under sparse stars, a letter left at the barber's, small movements that together could topple a ledger's quiet tyranny soon. By the time dawn threaded pale light through the shutter, she had rehearsed a dozen quiet possibilities: letters to deliver at odd hours, a friend in town who owed her mother a favor, a night ride with a purpose, and a patience that could outlast a father's habit of selling what did not belong to him. Her resolve settled into the shape of work to be done. She dressed with careful motions, folded the shawl into the trunk, and for the first time allowed herself to consider Elias not only as a man to resist, but as a reluctant ally whose calm might serve as a scaffold for plans requiring strength she did not yet possess. She stepped to the door and pressed her ear to the wood, listening for the cadence of the ranch horses' breathing, distant cursing, the rhythmic thud of men who thought themselves masters of land and ledger alike. And then she opened the door to meet whatever the day would demand of her. Days moved slowly on the ranch, each dawn arriving with the same disciplined indifference, and each night folding the sky into a hush that felt like scrutiny. Clara carried silence as armor, answering in measured phrases and keeping to shadowed corners so that gossip had no easy target. The knife she had slammed into the table remained wrapped and hidden. Its presence was a private comfort that warmed her palm when anxiety pressed close. Routine became a scaffold she could trust, and she used chores to shape time and keep panic at bay. Elias performed his duties with the kind of steadiness that renders chaos manageable. He checked fences with meticulous hands, balanced needs against resources, and moved among men with a calm that suggested training rather than sudden mercy. Clara watched from thresholds and low windows, recording small gestures, how he paused at the creek to inspect water clarity, the careful manner in which he guided apprentices learning to shoe a mule, and the hush of his voice when he spoke to a child who had skinned a knee. She did not trust the gentleness she saw, yet she could not ignore the possibility that kindness and authority might coexist. One morning, a book lay at her door, its spine worn and its pages softened by handling. She flung it aside in pride, at first resisting what felt like charity, but later, when the house had settled, she opened the cover and sampled a paragraph. Stories of women who reshaped modest prospects with cunning and labor-filled margins with strategies rather than romance, and Clara felt a surprising hunger for tactics that offered options more feasible than flight. More books followed. Within a week, a new title arrived almost every dawn: manuals on mending, essays about earning trade, novels about women bartering wits for independence. The sequence felt intentional, as if an invisible tutor had assembled a personal course for her emancipation. She read when the hearth was low and when tasks allowed the slender permission of idle fingers, collecting ideas that stitched together a feasible plan to escape the ledger that had defined her worth. Elias did not interrogate her reading. He responded with practical courtesies: a loaf placed on the hearth without announcement, a repaired boot set by the doorway, a blanket folded on a chair. He made room without claiming intimacy, and that reserve complicated her judgment of him. Observing a man perform useful charity without edge or expectation suggested boundaries she could respect without selling her person in exchange for comfort. One evening a guitar tune drifted through the hall, unexpected and soft. Clara paused in the doorway and listened while the chords unspooled like careful speech. Elias sat beneath a lamp with the instrument across his knees, coaxing phrases that revealed memory and softness rather than bluntness. The music mapped an interior she had not been given permission to see, and Clara retreated before the last note fell because witnessing that private tenderness felt like an intrusion she had not earned. The books became practical lessons. She taught Lila to read by lamplight, whispering letters until curiosity took root. She offered mending services to a neighbor who repaid her with eggs, taught a miner's daughter to sew in exchange for extra flour, and turned small skills into steady barter. Each repaired coat and patient tutoring hour added a coin of independence to a purse that had none before. Small rebellions accumulated into visible patterns. She smashed a plate once and allowed the sound to echo across the yard as a public act of refusal. She reserved a portion of grain and hid it where her father would not count it against supplies, and she left a discreet note with a friend in town requesting work under a false name. These acts were measured and perilous. In Redstone, small gestures could topple reputations, but the risk was necessary to create space for agency. Elias's music became a steady thread in the house, not performance but presence. He sometimes played for stable hands and sometimes alone late at night. Once he left a slim book of folk songs at her door, annotated with notes about the tune's origins and the labor that birthed them. Clara read the stories that accompanied the melodies and kept the volume close, surprised by gratitude that did not demand reciprocity. Threats arrived in the ordinary way: cruelty visits a town, a trader suggested the family sell another asset to cover mounting claims, and neighbors muttered about bargains yet to be struck. Clara responded methodically rather than with spectacle. She compiled a list of women in town who could teach or repair goods, documented favors owed, and sketched a plan to trade skill for wage. Elias observed without flourish and then, quietly at dawn, rode into town to negotiate a modest delay with a supplier, an action that offered necessary breathing room and altered immediate risk. Late one night, the house was still, and the wind moved in thin fingers across the porch when Clara made a choice that felt less like surrender and more like strategy. She crept down the steps holding a small parcel of receipts and notes that recorded favors owed, names of women who could teach, and a short list of goods she could barter. In the lamplight, Elias sat at the kitchen table with the guitar leaning against a chair. His face looked tired but not unkind, and his hands rested on a folded ledger of routines and responsibilities. He did not startle at her entrance, Instead he offered a small steady silence that invited explanation without demanding recounting. She set the papers on the table and explained, quietly and precisely, the people she could call upon, the repairs she could undertake, and the months of careful work that might turn skill into a living. He listened, not with the impatience of a man deciding fate, but with the patience of someone taking in coordinates for a route he might help map. He thumbed through her list, studied names and obligations, and then placed his hand flat over the papers in a gesture that felt more like a pledge than a command. He promised to stand with her while she negotiated small trades, and to speak for a short while with suppliers who would otherwise look away. Her breath caught at the soft offer and she answered with a nod that sealed an unspoken compact. Ever felt trapped but glimpsed something real? Share your thoughts below. Elias invited her at dawn when light first gilded fence posts, and the corral sighed, and Clara, after a heartbeat of doubt, mounted a gentle mare that answered her touch with patient steadiness. Silence rode between them at first, practical talk about pumps and leaks shading intimacy into work. He pointed toward worn valves and hollow lines, named signs of a failing trough, with the certainty of someone who had kept land alive across hungry seasons. She listened not because she accepted her fate, but because knowledge felt like something salvageable, a tool she might wield. The plains spread in a burnt palette, ochre and rust, grasses flattened where drought had breathed, wind carried the metallic scent of sun-baked metal and the thin perfume of distant sage. They moved through that wide place with the low sound of hooves setting pace, and each measured step seemed to sheath the noise inside her until thought could creep forward without panic. He rode steady, jaw set like a hinge that had learned to bear weight. His directions were brief, his tone unfussy, and the world he described was practical rather than grand: trenches to reroute runoff, improvised dams where cattails might take root if water were coaxed. At a low rise the ranch lay behind them, smoke thinning from the cookfire, while ahead a fork opened where two washes split the earth like a choice stitched in dust. Elias dismounted and set his boots in the loam, the small thud of his step plain in the empty air. He inclined his head toward the trail that bent toward Redstone Station, and then at the lane that curled back to the homestead, and he did not speak in commands but in a manner so plain it felt like relief. "You can go, there are no strings." That phrase landed in her like a stone and made ripples. The station represented a chance to vanish into motion, the iron rails promised passage, and the possibility of work where names mattered less than labor. Trains carried anonymity, new towns rooms that rented by week, and a life reconstructed by wages and will. Leaving meant stepping into uncertain crowds and learning to fold herself smaller. It also meant risk: traders, strangers, nights without the safety of a locked door or a man whose silence might keep certain dangers at bay. Returning to the ranch meant shelter inside a known frame, familiarity that brought predictability, access to resources, a scaffold on which to build slow autonomy by trade and skill. She weighed both futures with the method of someone schooled in scarcity, inventorying debts, favors and small assets as if mapping a route. Images lined up in her mind: Redstone Station with its whistle and travelers whose faces blurred with each passing. A room above a bakery where light might fall differently. The ranch house with its wide eaves and a kitchen that smelled of broth and leather. The possibility of teaching Lila letters by lamplight. Elias watched her study the horizon and then, without impatience, described the practicalities of each path. How the station's work was uneven and required quick trade skills. How a woman there might find sewing or washing for lodgings but also face men who kept ledgers with sharp edges. How the ranch obliged steadier toil but allowed the slow accrual of autonomy through barter and earned trust among hands. He spoke of no great rescue, only measures that made survival possible: a delay in delivery to creditors, a temporary labor swap, a neighbor owing a favor that could be called in for a week of wages. Clara absorbed this inventory like a ledger of small mercies, and for the first time the notion of choice felt less like a mockery and more like a map she could read. She noticed the small things about Elias in that moment: the way his calloused fingers flexed around a spur, a scar at the left temple that caught the light, the absence in his eyes that suggested a life scarred by loss rather than simply hardened by industry. When he crouched to check a rusty joint in a water line, she saw him move with a careful economy, fingers accustomed to coaxing purpose from unpromising tools. Up close his voice carried the same sparse cadence as on the ridge, and that restraint made his offer of freedom stranger because it traded drama for respect. She felt the pull of the unknown along the station line and the quiet gravity of the homestead in her chest at once, as if two magnets tugged different parts of her heart. Choice, she realized, would be less an instant and more a series of small commitments, one letter sent, one favor called, one night spent away to test the world beyond. He did not demand an answer, instead he suggested a way to measure consequence. Spend the night in town if you must. If the noise suits you, find a room. If the work supports you, stay. If it breaks you, come back. The simplicity of his terms gave her a shape for action, a temporary trial rather than an all-or-nothing leap. She imagined Lila learning to read without the stain of barter, counting each lesson, and in that mental picture a responsibility and a permission braided together, duty to protect and permission to choose for both sisters. The ride home folded dusk into a tender blue, and the mare's gait eased the tension it had carried earlier. The landscape softened, shadows lengthened, and a gull of light spread low along the horizon like a bookmark for what might come. Elias kept a respectful distance as they returned, neither closing the space between them nor abandoning her to solitude, and that measured courtesy felt less like resignation and more like an invitation to collaborate in a future neither of them could fully script. In the quiet of the ranch yard she tested the offer he'd given, not an ultimatum but a route sketched in honest terms, and in testing it she discovered the shape of her own resolve. Later she would walk the station's platform under lantern glare and measure the industry of strangers, and she would also learn how to mend a leather strap well enough to sell it for a week of flour. She would find that freedom often arrived through small trades, and the accrual of tiny dignity. On the hilltop she chose the ranch not because the road had closed, but because the choice felt newly hers, a selection born from assessment rather than compulsion. She turned toward home with a steadier breath and a horizon washed with faint hope. The day's ride having shifted the grammar of what free might mean in a life that had once known only transactions. She folded that new possibility like a map into her pocket, promising herself to test limits with cautious steps, to call in favors, to barter time for learning, to measure safety before daring flight. In choosing the homestead she did not surrender dreams but recalibrated them into actions, small enough to carry yet large enough to change a sister's fate, and perhaps a town's quietly shifting heart, and held hope steady. A folded scrap of paper slid beneath Clara's door as dusk thinned to a cool, watchful blue. She bent, scooped it up, and read fast strokes cramped with fear, rather than art. Lila's handwriting, small and hurried, spelled a sentence that struck like a thrown stone. Father plans to trade me for whiskey. A cold clarity replaced panic. Her pulse settled into a steady, dangerous rhythm. She clenched the note until the paper creased, and then smoothed it as if calming two hearts with a single gesture. Without hesitating, she crossed the yard where shadows pooled under the eaves and the barn smelled of hay and old leather. She shoved through the barn door and found Elias at a saddle, hands steady over worn leather as if he could stitch common sense into frayed harnesses. She unfolded the paper and read the sentence aloud so that his calm could meet the fact, not the rumor. His jaw tightened briefly and then set like a rule. He rose without a word, eyes meeting hers with the tacit permission to act. Together they saddled two horses with quiet efficiency, a rhythm learned by men and women who survive by readiness rather than fancy. The sun sat low and hard, the light cutting the plains into strips of copper and shadow as they rode hard toward Redstone. The wind drove dust across the trail in waves and stung their cheeks like an accusation, but the urgency in Clara's chest lent speed to their mount. Townfolk paused at doorways and windows. The saloon's swinging sign creaked as if it wanted to speak. When they reached the street, heat pooled under their boots and gossip tightened into a chorus of mutters. Inside, the saloon was a bowl of noise, card shuffles, the hiss of spittoons, laughter threaded with tobacco and drink. Her father sat slumped at a table, a whiskey glass his constant companion and a half-remembered pride clogging his expression. He tried to slough off the protest, blaming debts, business and bad luck, but his defenses wore thin like old cloth. Clara stepped forward without a flourish. She did not scream or demand. She held the note between her fingers and let its blunt truth hang in the room. Elias stood beside her, not as a threat but as a wall, his posture wide and unwavering. The broker who handled bargains and bone-deep trades blinked at the paper and then into a practiced smile that smelled of contract rather than conscience. Words followed like blows. The broker spoke of customs and debts. Her father tried to conjure explanations, and Clara laid out what the exchange would mean for a child barely old enough to lift a pail. She addressed the crowd with a voice steady despite the tremor beneath. Daughters are not livestock to be moved with a ledger finger. The room rustled with discomfort. Some hated her for the truth because it made them remember bargains they had accepted themselves. She named neighbors who would vouch for Lila's skills and for the family's need to preserve a reputation without destroying a girl's life. The broker produced worn papers and phrases that clipped corners off a plea, but Elias countered in a tone that did not rage but did cut. Such trades are not a right here. He offered a plan rather than threats, a delay to settle accounts, work to be arranged so Lila might earn keep, and a neighbor who would shelter the girl while debts were negotiated. The broker attempted to bristle at the idea of delay but found fewer allies as murmurs turned into side conversations about decency. Clara watched her father take in the turn of events and saw something break under his skin, shame or relief she could not decide. She felt a small bright spark of something like hope catch at the base of her throat. It was not trust for Elias but recognition that he would act in defense rather than price. They left the saloon with Lila tucked under Clara's arm, small and trembling but alive with the rawness of being spared at a moment when transactions usually finished business without pity. The ride back was slower, full of plans spoken in low tones, bargains mapped like stitches along a sea. Clara visited neighbors and old friends, asking favors with the humility of someone who knows how to tally social credit. 2 eggs for a lesson taught. A week of shelter in return for mending a coat. Elias used his name and standing to negotiate a credit delay with suppliers, words simple and factual that carried weight where pleas would not. By dusk they had cobbled together contingencies. A neighbor agreed to take Lila into a cottage for a fortnight, a mason pledged work in exchange for payment delayed until harvest, and a baker offered bread in exchange for lessons taught to apprentice. Clara organized a plan that fit like a patchwork quilt. Small trades to cover immediate need and careful work to build future independence. She learned quickly that survival here depended as much on cleverness and humility as on courage. She turned embarrassment into currency and bartered dignity for time. That night she stood with Elias by the barn, moonlight laying silver ribbons across stacked hay, and asked him why he had ridden with her. He answered simply that he could not watch an injustice without intervening, that some debts were immoral regardless of ink and signature. The explanation sat between them as a kind of truce. It did not erase past shadows, but offered a basis to move forward with cautious alliance. Clara felt gratitude tempered by caution. She understood that protection bought by influence could curdle into guardianship if unchecked, and she would not trade one owner for another. She promised to keep the agency at the center of any arrangement, and Elias promised practical help rather than permission. They arranged a schedule. Neighbors would rotate watching Lila, Clara would teach and mend in exchange for food and coin, and Elias would use his standing to ensure that suppliers tolerated a delay. The network they assembled was fragile but immediate, a braid of favors and small mercies that might hold long enough for harvest to loosen tightened belt. Days that followed were dense with labor and small negotiations. Clara learned to knit a reliable shawl and to mend a seam so the skill could be sold for bread. She taught Lila letters by candlelight, and Lila, her cheeks hollowed by worry, learned to make words like to. Clara kept a ledger of her own, names, favors owed, promises to collect, and the modest incomes that slowly padded their account against ruin. Sometimes fear returned in cold flashes. Men in taverns who still thought daughters could be moved as assets. A trader who eyed Lila with the old calculation in his stance. Yet each time the community they had pulled together responded, favors were repaid in kind, doors opened where they once would have shut, and the ledger that had threatened them lost a little of its teeth. Clara's fury had been the spark, but action built the shelter, strategy, allies, and the willingness to ask for help without shame. She had stood up when it mattered and found that standing could be contagious, that one refusal could invite another. Her question to the world remained, when have you stood up for someone you love? Tell us in the comments. In Redstone Saloon, the air thickened with tobacco and sweat as the town gathered in a hush that smelled of old bargains and new curiosity. Clara stepped forward with deliberate feet, paper pinched between her fingers, and said without tremor that Lila was not a commodity to be sold for whiskey or relief. Heads turned, glasses stilled, the dealer's shuffle died, and an awkward silence stretched like pulled leather. Her father's face flushed with a combination of shame and something brittle. He fidgeted with a glass as if the bottle could stitch courage back into him. Murmurs rippled, then stilled, because a claim spoken aloud required an answer more honest than the ledger's ink. Elias moved to her side as if stepping into the frame of a long photograph. He did not loiter or threaten, but his presence reorganized the room's balance. He positioned himself not as an overlord demanding recompense, but as a steady figure whose stance suggested protection rather than purchase. When he spoke, his voice was low and direct, and he declared plainly that no child belonged to a ledger. The announcement cut through cigar smoke and poker chatter with the force of a bell. Men who had measured worth by cattle and coin blinked, recalculating in private arithmetic. Clara kept speaking, each sentence a careful strike aimed at the broker's assumptions. She named Lila's age, described the child's nimble fingers that could sew a mend or feed a neighbor in trade, and explained how a girl's future could not be repaid with bottles or momentary relief. She addressed the room with a plain dignity that demanded more than sympathy. She demanded arrangements that preserved a life. Her father attempted to sputter explanations about debts and arrangements, but his voice found no traction when weighed against a daughter's steady truth. The saloon's audience shifted visibly. Women at the back tucked knitting closer, recalling chores done without complaint, and a blacksmith who once calculated transactions over ale lowered his head. A woman at the bar, who had once been on the receiving end of a similar bargain, rose and offered a quiet witness that changed the tenor of the crowd. Her action loosened other tongues and severed the ease with which profit had been prioritized over people. Elias's answer remained practical rather than theatrical. He sketched a plan that favored delay and humane arrangements over a showdown that might spill blood and ruin more than one household. He proposed negotiated deferments with suppliers, temporary lodging for the girl with a neighbor known for steady hands, and work for Clara that could produce coin and keep Lila safe while a longer solution was arranged. The trader who had hoped to seal the exchange recoiled into shadow, balked at public scrutiny and found fewer allies than he had expected. Clara watched Elias negotiate, noting how he invoked mutual debts and quiet favors instead of threats. His leverage lay in reputation and the simple fact that people still answered to a standard when reminded of it. Relief threaded through her chest like cool water, but caution tempered hope. She knew well that today's shelter could become tomorrow's stranglehold if gratitude turned to control. They left the saloon with Lila tucked close to Clara, small hand clenched around a sleeve, eyes wide but unbroken. The journey back to the ranch unfolded as a series of practical arrangements. Elias called a supplier on the walk, asking for a short extension until harvest. A baker who owed a favor with greasecloth offered a sack of flour. Neighbors pledged temporary food and lodging. Each promise was a stitch in a quick repair job meant to keep ruin from tearing everything loose. Back at home they mapped out a schedule. Clara would take in mending and teach Lila to read by lamplight, neighbors would rotate shelter duties, and Elias would use his standing to ensure credibility when promises were made. Those measures were fragile but immediate, and the speed of their assembly underlined a truth Clara had long known: survival here required converting indignation into a plan. News of the confrontation spread through Redstone with a different rhythm than Gassif. People discussed decency as much as profit, weighing their choices aloud. The saloon that once hosted effortless bargains, now felt like a place where reputations would count for something other than coin. Men who had casually considered daughters as assets, now found themselves chastened by the public refusal. Clara and Lila rebuilt a small steady routine, lessons by candlelight, and mending for eggs, hours traded for flour, and the slow accrual of dignity in the form of earned resources rather than purchased silence. Elias visited often with supplies and spoke plainly with neighbors, asking favors as a man who expected to repay them, not as one who collected debt. The community, shaken, began to stitch loose nets of mutual aid. Where debt had isolated, conversation started knitting people into a modest safety web. Clara reflected on what courage had accomplished in a single afternoon, forcing attention, demanding alternatives, and creating space for action rooted in labor and reciprocity rather than shame. She realized moral clarity mattered, but so did the hard mechanics of sustained safety plans, lists, named allies, and careful work that turned sympathy into concrete survival. The showdown had punctured complacency and exposed the possibility that one refusal could cascade into structural change when neighbors chose conscience over convenience. The saloon, once a theater for deals, had and demanded dignity instead of profit, reshaping how bargains stood. They rode until the horses slowed and the land opened into a dry creek bed, where water had once lingered, stones like ribs beneath cottonwoods. Elias dismounted with practiced ease, fingers finding the mare's wither as if to measure patience, and Clara followed, chest tight with an ache born from bargaining and loss. Shadows shortened, wind moved grain across the plain, and they settled on a flat stone while the valley seemed to hold its breath. Elias began in a low voice threaded with memory. He named Anna and spoke of small things that made her real in his telling. A crooked laugh, a habit of braiding her hair before dawn, a stubborn kindness that left a pot simmering for the hungry. He did not justify himself, he described what he had loved and then lost. The wedding that bound Anna had been arranged, not mercy, and what followed hollowed him. Clara listened like someone who had learned that truth appears in detail. She noticed scars that suggested attempts to mend rather than to harden, and the confession shifted the frame in which she had seen him. Elias became a man haunted by a past mistake rather than solely an owner of land. She reached into her trunk and drew her mother's faded handkerchief, a square of linen smelling faintly of rose, and pressed it into Elias's palm. The gesture was simple and intimate. He folded the cloth carefully, fingers lingering as if it carried permission to speak more honestly. Dusk washed the horizon gold and violet while the creek murmured. Elias described attempts at atonement, planting a willow, speaking names aloud so memory would not rot, tending small honors that felt like duty rather than superstition. Those acts had taught him restraint. Clara returned the confession with practicality. She described the ledger and how her father's debts treated names like cattle. She explained Lila's plea, the terror of being traded for drink, and mapped favors owed and skills she could convert into coin. She named those in town who would help without shame and those who would look the other way. Elias listened and absorbed the coordinates he could help with, who might shelter a child and which supplier could be asked for time. They named small human details that turned abstraction into trust. Clara spoke of her mother's folded cloth. Elias recalled how Anna bent the tail of a written Y. Those tiny memories felt like currents. They laughed once, softly, at a memory of Anna chasing a pup and dropping a lantern into a stew pot. The laugh loosened the tension and made proximity less formal. As darkness deepened, Elias explained his practical resolution. He had held power and misused it, and the cost had been a life he could not reclaim. That lesson shaped his refusal to use influence to bind another's will. Clara saw that his refusal at the altar had roots in atonement, not rhetoric. Elias told how small rituals had kept memory honest, visiting a marker, planting a willow where Anna once sat, and reading her name aloud so forgetting would not swallow a life. He admitted grief had been a tutor that taught restraint, that power wielded without conscience had left a wound he could not repair with coin. Those admissions reshaped the sense of the man who had stood at the altar. Clara answered with gritty practicality. She explained trades that turned skill into shelter, mending a coat in exchange for a sack of flour, teaching a neighbor's child to read for a week of lodgings, stitching patches that could be sold for coin. She outlined favors owed and who might repay them. She named those in town who would help without shame and those who would look the other way. Speaking plans turned fear into a rout. They discussed danger in plain terms and agreed on signals. 3 knocks on a certain shutter meant immediate flight. A kerchief left on a chair meant danger was gone. Elias promised to ride with any wagon that looked like trouble and to secure a supplier's patience. Their talk was pragmatic rather than romantic, full of steps to be executed rather than vows to be held up for applause. Naming small domestic details became its own catechism. Lila's way of tying hair, a kettle's familiar dent, the exact cadence of a mother's reading. Those particulars were tools. A neighbor who could verify Lila's skills, a baker who remembered a debt. They sketched a human ledger, who would feed the child, who would shelter her, and which trades could raise small capital. Elias then offered a small tin containing a pressed wildflower Anna had loved, folded into the handkerchief. He did not ask forgiveness. He provided a reminder to act. Clara touched the bloom with a careful finger and set modest expectations. They agreed on simple signals for urgent danger and arrangements for favors to be called and repaid, drafting a human ledger of small kindnesses rather than contracts enforced by ink. When they mounted to ride back, the air had cooled to clarity. Clara felt steadiness she had not known. Confession had not erased the ledger's threat, but it had reframed where action could occur. Trust, she understood, would be built by visible tasks delivered to neighbors. Sacks of flour, negotiated delays, a sheltered child sleeping safe. The ride home traced a slow arc beneath stars. Names: Anna, Lila. Her mother's quiet measures moved through Clara's mind like threads to be woven into plans. Elias was no longer merely an enigmatic figure at a ceremony, but a man with a ruinous history who had learned restraint. The silence between them became companionable and calibrated for cooperation. The handkerchief's scent warmed her palm like a held promise. They reached the ranch where the house waited like a patient listener, and the night smelled of hay and distant fire. Clara stepped into the dark with a list of tests to apply: call a supplier for a week, teach a neighbor's child for bread, deliver men's to a widow who paid in flour. The creek bed exchange had not been absolution but the start of mutual accountability. They had learned to trade truth rather than power, What moment changed how you saw someone? Share below. Under a moon that hollowed the saloon into a silver-sheen stage, Clara wrapped ash across her cheek and tied a faded scarf so only resolve remained visible. She moved with practiced caution, stepping between shadow and shudder, as if the night itself could betray her. The town breathed shallowly, and the lamps guttered, but gossip never fully slept, and she kept to alleys where eyes did not pick clean details from the darkness. The saloon's back door had been left ajar by a bartender who tended more to habit than vigilance, and Clara eased through that gap with the patience of someone accustomed to making small rebellions survive. Inside, the scent of tobacco and spilled whiskey hung over tables like an old expectation, and poker chips acted like promises sealed in ink that never read human faces. Her hand found the ledger's corner first, charred at one edge where she had tested fire earlier, and she lifted the book with hands steady from labor and hunger. Heat quickened in her chest at the thought of pages that listed names as if they were things to be moved, sold, or bartered, and she set the book on a vacant table with the care of someone placing a live ember where it could do its work. A match struck, and flame took ink in memory with greedy appetite as Clara watched old transactions curl into smoke, each page a promise of forgetting slowly consumed. The fire sizzled and the room smelled like burned paper and past bargains, and for a suspended moment the saloon held a hush that felt like a verdict. Then two rough hands closed on her wrist, fingers like clamps used to better secure ledgers than people, and men pushed her into lamplight where faces leaned in like predators studying quarry. Voices rose with a mixture of outrage and proprietary claim, and boots scuffed the floor as if to stamp civility into the grain. She did not shriek. The theater belonged to those who thought noise would save them, and Clara had learned that deliberate action carried sharper teeth. She held the charred stub of paper and named the offense plainly. A girl could not be traded to drown another man's thirst, and a ledger that counted daughters like coin deserved to burn. Her father muttered excuses that smelled of whiskey and worn pride, and neighbors shifted uneasily because truth stings where profit once soothed conscience. Men murmured about customs and old deals, bending toward the broker who had looked at Lila with a purchase in his eyes, but Clara spoke with the authority of someone who had decided to refuse being accounted for. At that moment, Elias stepped into the doorway, his boots confident and his shoulders carried without pretense, the presence of a man used to trust and obligation altering the room's balance. He did not shout nor brandish. Instead, his voice landed like a fine tool, steady and exact, and he spoke of social debts that could be called if a community tolerated violence cloaked in commerce. His words were a kind of currency in themselves, heavy enough to shift loyalties and light enough to avoid bloodshed that would ruin more than a family or a ledger could repair. The broker frowned and tried to marshal muscle in response, the reflex of men who believe coin solves scruples, but Elias named suppliers who depended on reputation and neighbors who kept accounts in memory, and those things carry consequences in a town where everyone remembers favors and slights. The men who had reached for Clara's wrist cooled like embers when they realized that social censure could cost more than a scuffle. One by one they stepped back into shadow, leaving only the hum of surprised conversation. Clara exhaled with a force that felt like a small reclamation and gathered Lila close, the child's breathing a fragile counterpoint to the night's anger. They left the saloon with quick appointments made by lantern light, neighbors agreeing to rotate shelter and a baker promising bread in exchange for lessons taught to an apprentice, small mercies that arranged themselves like necessary scaffolding. Elias offered no patronizing hand but gave practical support instead, a neighbor who would host the child, a supplier who would grant a short deferment, and a promise to use influence without claiming ownership. On the porch of the ranch later, the three of them sat with a distance kept by caution and the common exhaustion of work still to be done. Lila slept under a quilt of borrowed patches, breathing with the brittle relief of someone who had been spared from sale but not spared from the memory of terror. Clara spoke plainly about tasks to be done: teach the child to read for food, mend clothes for coin, call in favors that had been banked by quiet kindness, and move quickly to build a ledger of moral credit rather than inked oppression. They listed names and times, mapped routes a child could take in minutes, and rehearsed a signal, a series of 3 knocks on a shutter that would mean flee at once and ride for the hills. The night's actions had been dramatic, but their consequence would depend on the slow mechanics of labor and reciprocity. Ashes are easy to make and hard to transform into lasting safety without a plan. Clara felt the ledger's weight shift in her mind from static shame to a problem to be solved by work and cunning rather than by dramatic outlawry alone. Elias listened without grand gestures, And when he spoke it was to offer leverage rather than command. He would talk to the supplier, ride with a suspicious wagon, and be present as a steady witness when men tried to cheat or intimidate. The ranch offered resources if one knew how to call them into play, and he used his standing to negotiate short extensions that would buy time for harvest and patience for favors to be repaid. They scheduled staggered shelters so no one house carried the social burden alone, and they arranged barter deals that converted short labor into immediate resources like flour, soap and warm bedding. The structure they built was fragile but practical, a patchwork of human favors and small economic exchanges that could hold a family until more durable stability arrived. Morning arrived cold and pale, and for Clara the hours that followed were full of tasks that felt less like heroics and more like necessary work, teaching letters, mending hems, delivering a repaired strap to a neighbor who paid in eggs. Each small act filled a space the ledger had torn and converted indignation into a sustainable routine, and she learned that dignity accumulates like coin when repeated actions are honest and public. People began to murmur differently in Redstone, talk shifted from betting on bargains to counting favors owed, and a few consciences stirred at the idea that a community could choose decency over the convenience of cold purchase. The saloon's reputation altered at the edges as neighbors who once looked away now hesitated before making transactions involving kin, and the broker found his usual ease interrupted by public scrutiny. Hope threaded through town. Spring came like a promise kept, softening plains where dust had lain like old grief. Green pushed through brittle earth in shoots, and the ranch breathed a gentler rhythm. Clara and Elias worked shoulder to shoulder beneath wide skies, shaping a small house from timber and long afternoons. Windows cut broad to capture light, and a door hung so it could be latched from inside as if safety could be made into a hinge. She drew plans with a steady hand and argued for rooms that welcomed sound rather than sealed it, for a kitchen where laughter might be an ingredient, and for a narrow study where Lila could spread alphabet cards without apology. They planted a rosebush against the porch, its roots tangling with the ground like a promise. Its thorns reminded them that beauty and defense could belong together. Lila wrote letters to friends in borrowed roofs, the script small but deliberate, each line a stitch in a life mending itself. Neighbors brought seed, tools and a pie that tasted of community. Hands that had once glanced away now left boards at Clara's feet without question. Clara taught Lila to read by candle and by window, showing how letters could be keys more durable than bargains, and the child's eyes brightened with each unlocked word. Elias copied saplings to fashion a porch swing and fixed shutters that fit with the snugness of a well-tailored habit. He offered steady skill so hope could be built rather than borrowed. In the house they crafted a latch for privacy and hung curtains that sheltered dreams, and when night came they ate by lamplight and measured days in work accomplished rather than ledgers undone. Spring rain darkened the soil. Clara planted vegetables and staked beans to climb like tiny ambitions. The rosebush took root and stretched, and when a storm snapped a branch, Elias tended it with slow, careful hands while Clara felt relief settle into her chest. Letters arrived from Lila about children she tutored, and the way small kindness multiplied, each envelope was a victory. Clara stacked like coins. Word spread that the Holt home was open for rent of talent. Clara mended garments, taught reading and arranged lessons for women who wanted to earn independence. Payment came in eggs, flour and small cash saved in a jar beneath a loose board, the currency of pragmatic dignity. They renewed vows in a chapel that smelled of candle wax, not because law demanded it but because two people who had navigated a bargain chose to mark a beginning. Clara spoke first, saying she chose Elias because she wanted to, because choosing was the lesson she had fought to learn. His eyes shone like a weathered map she had come to trust. He promised not to wield influence as a cage and to be a partner in labor and repair, and the congregation made room with slow clapping and faces moist with honest feeling. Afterward there was music under an open tent and children ran with paper flowers and the scent of baking drifted like a benediction. Lila read a verse she'd learned about gardens and courage, and her voice carried across the yard like proof that teaching multiplied. People who had once bet on misfortune now visited with offerings and with requests for lessons. The saloon's rough talk lost some arrogance when neighbors preferred trade by hand to inked names. Clara kept a ledger of her own, not of debts but of favors owed and returned, a public accounting that turned obligation into shared labor. She taught a woman to sew a hem so she could feed 3 children, and Elias rode with a small party into town to bargain for seeds at a fair price rather than one exacted by threat. Doors in Redstone opened easier than months before, and children chased each other across sprouted grass like officers of a future where barter fed growth rather than fear. At dusk after chores were done, Clara sat on the step with Lila at her knee and a cup of tea warming her hands, watching fireflies stitch the dark with light. Sometimes Elias brought a guitar and played low tunes that folded into evening and softened work into ceremony. Other nights he taught Lila to knot rope or read a map. The house became a promise built on small acts and consistent measures. Locks that closed from within, a pantry with stores, a list of neighbors who would answer if trouble came. Clara met with women who formed a circle to teach trades and to plan a coffer for emergencies. Lila's dream to teach held the center of their work, and they organized classes under a wide elm that shaded learning with leaves. Redstone shifted, not in one triumphant gulp but in a steady rearrangement of priorities. Where money once spoke loudest, reputation and reciprocity grew louder. Clara thought often of the ledger that had burned and of the night the town chose to look at itself. The ash was a beginning that remade who counted and why. Neighbors mended fences together, shared seeds in spring, and saved for a communal chest should hunger stalk late summer. Practical alliances made survival communal. Elias and Clara hosted an evening where neighbors told stories and confessed small wrongs, and in that confession the town learned humility that prevented old bargains from repeating. Lila grew into her teaching with gentle firmness, and children learned letters that became sentences that spoke of dignity, notes that said you were worth more than a transaction. One afternoon Clara walked the square and watched a trader hesitate before making an offer that would have involved a child. He looked at gathered faces and walked away, choosing work instead of purchase. Spring's green deepened into summer, and each harvest built stores that were honest and enough. The house's windows caught light and reflected it back to the street like a modest beacon guiding small choices. At night the porch light burned low, and Clara sometimes whispered thanks into the dark for the stubbornness that had kept her fingers steady on a knife and later turned into careful plans instead of flight. She knew choice had been costly and vigilance would always be necessary, but she felt the small joy of a life reassembled in ways that could be taught to a child, and passed forward. Months turned and small rituals settled into habit. Saturday markets traded mending for bread. A midweek reading circle taught letters to anyone who came with curious hands. Neighbors swapped tools and recipes in low-voiced barter, and a morning bell at the schoolhouse called children to lessons instead of chores. Old resentments learned new grammars as apologies were given and accepted, and practical kindness accumulated into a reserve used when weather and misfortune tested everyone. These routines stitched a fabric of trust that kept fear from unraveling future plans. If Clara's tale of courage and love gripped you, please like and subscribe to Frontier Hearts for more Wild West stories where grit and heart remake lives. Tap the bell so you never miss a story where people choose dignity and where the smallest acts of bravery reshape a town.